The letter she received promised salvation, but as often happens in life, all dreams can be shattered in an instant. A modest house overlooking the valley, a kind widower with calloused hands and steady work, a warm hearth for winter nights, and enough provisions to survive the harsh seasons. The letter even mentioned livestock. 5 goats, he wrote, enough for fresh milk and cheese that could be sold in town. But when Elena stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Copper Ridge, with her worn bag and the last remnants of her courage, no one came for her. No carriage was waiting, no familiar face scanned the crowd. Only an endless strip of barren land, the bites of the desert wind, and a girl barely 12 years old, standing in the shadow of the station building, in a dress patched with scraps of different fabrics, looking at Elena with eyes that had seen too much too soon. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" the girl asked in a barely audible whisper. Elena felt her throat tighten. "Yes." The girl nodded slowly, as if rehearsing the moment. "My dad died." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Elena felt the world tilt. "Where did he die?" "He died," the girl replied, with the brutal honesty of someone who understands that lying only prolongs the pain of the truth. "3 nights ago, he was taken by a fever. We buried him behind the house ourselves." She fell silent, studying Elena's face for signs of escape. "I'm Maria. He said you would come. That's why he sent the telegram, even though he could barely hold the pen." Elena's hands trembled on the handle of her bag. "There must be some mistake. I was supposed to marry him. We had an agreement." "Yes, ma'am," Maria replied, her voice remaining steady despite the tears filling her dark eyes. "He knew you were coming to be his wife, but he also knew he was dying. That's why he wrote to you anyway." Her small chin lifted in desperate pride. "Maybe you'll stay after all." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, causing her to gasp and filling her chest with an emptiness that seemed to echo through her bones. "How many of you are there?" she managed to ask. 5, Maria replied, then corrected herself with painful precision. 4, now that little Thomas has died, but we are still a family." She glanced at the carriage, which was already preparing to leave, as if expecting Elena to climb back in. "We have no one else, and little Anna still feeds on the goat when we can manage it." Elena stood still, listening to the coachman warn the stragglers one last time. The carriage that had carried her across 3 states hissed and creaked, then jerked forward, as if knowing she would never return. She looked at her worn boots, then at the bag that contained all she had left, and at Maria, barefoot, her cheeks sunken, but standing straight as an oak despite the weight she carried. "Where is this house?" Elena asked quietly. Maria pointed to a distant hill where a thin column of smoke rose into the amber sky. "There's nothing to see. Just like me." For the first time, something like hope flashed across Maria's face. Without a word, she picked up Elena's bag, as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire short life. Elena walked past the station, her steps uncertain, her heart broken in 2. She had come to the West to marry a stranger and build a new life. Instead, she found herself following a child to the ruins of a dream, and 4 orphans who looked at her as if she were the only thing standing between them and the howling emptiness of the desert wind. She had no plan, no husband, no promise to keep. Only the sound of little feet ahead and a voice in her head whispering, "You didn't come here for love, but maybe you came for something more important." The house was smaller than she had dared to imagine. A 1-room shack with dilapidated walls, a roof with holes in it through which the sky was visible, and a door hanging on rusty hinges. The boards of the porch were warped and cracked, and the whole structure leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing up to the endless gusts of wind. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of smoke, boiled beans, and unwashed bedding that had not been tended to in months. Elena entered slowly, adjusting to the dim light. 4 pairs of eyes stared at her from the roughly hewn table. No, 3 pairs and a baby, sleeping in a wooden box by the cold fireplace, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days decades ago. The others sat motionless at the table, thin and silent, with empty bowls pushed away, as if they had given up on the idea that they would ever be filled. Maria put down Elena's bag and pointed to the only chair that was missing a leg or an armrest. "That was Dad's place," she said simply. Elena's throat tightened. "Then it will remain empty." Maria nodded, and understanding flashed between them like a shared secret. A boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old slowly stood up, straightening his shoulders despite his height. "I'm Diego," he introduced himself. "I chop wood and throw it on the fire." His voice betrayed the weight of responsibility that must have rested on the shoulders of someone 3 times his age. Next to him stood a girl with tangled dark hair and serious eyes, clutching a wooden spoon like a weapon. "I'm Rosa. I cook whatever there is." Her words were businesslike, but Elena detected a tremor in her voice. "My mother taught me before the cough took her last winter." Elena knelt down next to the box with the baby. "And this little one?" "Anna," Maria replied quietly. "She hasn't been well since—" She didn't finish her sentence, but Elena understood. Since everything had collapsed. Since the world had become too heavy a burden for such a small person. Without a word, Elena rolled up her sleeves. In her bag, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, she kept a small piece of salted lard and a handful of dried vegetables, provisions she had saved for the journey. It wasn't much, but she had learned long ago that a little could prolong life more than most people thought. She found a dented pot, poured water from the jug, which was barely enough to drink, and set to work. First, she threw the salted lard into the pot, then the vegetables and a precious pinch of herbs she had saved for her wedding dinner. A simple but rich aroma began to rise from the pot, filling the small space with something that had been missing for so long. The promise of food that could truly satisfy. The children watched her silently, following her every move. When she finally divided the thin stew among the plates, making sure the portions were equal, she stepped back against the wall and watched them eat. "Eat slowly," she said gently. "Let your bodies remember what it's like to be full." They obediently did as she asked, their hunger so strong that it turned to reverence. Rosa's eyes filled with tears, which she tried to hide behind her spoon. Diego ate with the cautious thoroughness of someone who had learned not to waste a single drop. Even little Anna stirred at the smell, making quiet sounds that might have meant satisfaction. Elena felt her own stomach twist with hunger, but she ignored it completely. This first meal was not for her. It was her promise to them, an acknowledgement that their hunger had become her responsibility and their needs her calling. When they were finished, she helped them wash in a basin of cold water outside, then tucked them into their shared bed, a mattress stuffed with straw and covered with all the blankets and pieces of fabric they could find. As she tucked the blankets up to their chins, she felt something unexpected, a strong protective reaction that seemed to come from the very depths of her being. That night, sitting on the broken steps of the porch, under a sky wide enough to hold all the sorrow in the world, Elena finally allowed herself to understand what had really happened. She hadn't just inherited 4 orphans. She had been called to a home full of broken hearts that had been abandoned to fate, and that first dinner together was her first step toward repairing what had been broken. Behind her, through the thin walls, she could hear them breathing, deeper and calmer than they had in months. For the first time since their father had died, they were sleeping without the agonizing pain of empty stomachs, and that one small mercy seemed to her the most important thing in her life. Later, while looking for something to patch the hole in Anna's blanket, Elena discovered a leather diary tucked under a loose board by the fireplace. The book was small and worn, its pages yellowed with age and dampness, and the binding was tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but was now faded. She opened it with cautious reverence, as if touching something sacred. The first pages contained brief notes in a neat hand, dates of birth and death, records of small harvests, sketches of improvements that had never been realized. Then, on the very last page, in handwriting that became increasingly uneven, she found her name. Elena Vasquez arrives on October 15th. She must be welcomed with everything we have. She comes with nothing, but we will make her rich with love. The words blurred as her eyes filled with tears. If I die before she arrives, tell her that I wrote her into our story before I wrote my end. Tell her that I believed she would choose us, even when I was gone. Elena clutched the diary to her chest, shaken by the dying man's faith in a woman he had never met. Somehow, even before his death, he saw something in their brief correspondence that gave him hope. Hope that she would stay. Hope that she would love his children. Hope that she would build something lasting on the ruins he was forced to leave behind. She looked around the small, shabby room, the cracked window panes, the worn-out children's shoes lined up by the door, the cold fireplace that had to be constantly stoked to keep warm in winter. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was the life she had been given. And for the first time since she had stepped off the stagecoach, she felt that she was exactly where she belonged. The trouble began on Tuesday morning when the sound of horses' hooves on the hard-packed ground came from outside the door. Elena was teaching Rosa how to bake bread from the last of the flour when she heard the approaching horsemen, not at the leisurely pace of neighbors, but at the determined rhythm of people who had come with a purpose. She went out into the street and saw 3 men dismounting from well-fed horses. Their clothes were clean and ironed, and their faces expressed the authority of people who never wonder where they will find their next piece of bread. At the front stood a man with gray hair and cold eyes, holding a rolled-up document in a glove. "You must be the woman who calls herself Elena Vasquez," he said, in a voice that betrayed a tone of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "I am Elena Vasquez," she replied, stepping onto the porch. Behind her she could hear the children approaching the door, their footsteps quiet but audible, a reminder that everything was hanging by a thread. "I'm Judge Morrison," the man continued, unfolding the document with theatrical precision. "I'm here to inform you that your presence in this house is illegal. Without a legal marriage, you have no right to these children or this property. They are now in the custody of the county, and I am here to escort them to the appropriate place." Elena's blood ran cold, but her voice remained steady. "I have a letter from their father, a document stating his wishes." Judge Morrison's smile was thin and cruel. "Letters are not legal documents, Miss Vasquez, and this man died with debts that the county now has to pay. These children need proper care, not some woman who answered a personal ad." Behind her, the door creaked open. Maria was the first to emerge, her young face full of determination that belied her age. Diego followed, his fists clenched at his sides. Even Rosa came out, carrying little Anna in her arms, her chin raised in defiance. "We're not going anywhere," Maria said in a clear, strong voice. "She's our family now." "That's not for you to decide, girl," Judge Morrison dismissed her. "You'll understand when you're older." "I understand now," Diego replied sharply. "I understand that she stayed when she could have left. I understand that she feeds us before she feeds herself. And I understand that you want to separate us and send us to strangers who don't care whether we live or die." Elena placed her hands on their shoulders, feeling the tension in their small bodies, the fear they were trying so hard to hide. "You won't take them away," she said quietly. "This house may not have legal documents, but it was built with love and sacrifice. These children are not lost property to be redistributed. This is their home." One of the other men stepped forward, placing his hand on his belt in a threatening gesture. But before he could say anything, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Problems, Elena?" everyone turned to see a man approaching, casually holding a rifle at the ready. His face was lined with wrinkles from years of exposure to the desert sun, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Elena had never seen him before, but Maria sighed quietly in relief. "Uncle Carlos," she whispered, although Elena suspected that their relationship was more friendly than familial. Carlos nodded to Elena, then looked intently at Judge Morrison, whose gaze had seen too much in this world to be impressed by titles and documents. "These children seem to have found a good mother. I don't see why anyone should be concerned." "This woman has no legal rights," Judge Morrison growled, but his voice lost some of its authority. "Legal rights?" Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. "She has the only right that matters. She earned it. And if you think you can come to this country and take these children away from the only stable home they know, you're going to be disappointed." The standoff lasted several long minutes, the tension mounting like a storm. Finally, Judge Morrison rolled up the document and remounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said, but his retreat spoke louder than his threats. When the horseman disappeared over the hill, Elena turned to Carlos. "Thank you," she said simply. He shrugged. "These children have suffered enough. They don't need strangers deciding their fate." He looked at Maria, Diego, Rosa, and little Anna with what could be mistaken for pride. "Besides, it seems they've already made their choice." That evening, as Elena was putting the children to bed, Maria grabbed her hand. "Are you really staying?" she asked, her voice sounding vulnerable for the first time since Elena's arrival. Elena brushed the girl's dark hair away from her face. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. You're stuck with me." Maria smiled, the first real smile Elena had seen on her face, and settled back on the pillow with a satisfaction that spoke louder than any legal document. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with such ferocity that it tested every scrap of fabric, every plank of wood, every carefully stored supply. But this time, they were ready. Elena spent the autumn months teaching the children how to preserve vegetables, mend clothes with strong seams, and stoke the fire so that it burned all night without consuming precious wood. Diego grew stronger, his arms developing muscles that come from hard work and regular food. Rosa became a master at making something out of nothing, preparing hearty stews from leftovers that wealthier households would have thrown away. Even Maria found her calling, caring for Anna with a tenderness beyond her young years, and helping Elena with the countless small tasks that kept their household running. They were no longer just surviving. They were thriving in a way that only people who had known real hardship could appreciate. The house was still small, still drafty, still teetering on the brink of financial ruin. But it was warm, and not just from the carefully tended fire. It was warm from the knowledge that every person in it was valued, needed, and loved. One December evening, when a heavy snowfall began, Elena sat by the fireplace mending Diego's torn shirt, while the children played quietly with stones and a rope. The scene was so peaceful, so ordinary, that it took her a few moments to realize how unusual what they had built together was. "Elena?" Rosa's voice was quiet and thoughtful. "What will happen to us when we grow up?" Elena looked up from her sewing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when we're old enough to leave? Will we still be a family?" The question hung in the air, heavy with all the uncertainty that accompanies children who have already lost so much. Elena put down her sewing and gathered everyone around her, even lifting Anna out of the box so she could join their circle. "Listen to me," she said, in a firm, determined voice. "Family isn't just blood. It's choosing each other, every day. It's staying together when things get tough, and celebrating when things get better. It's being there for each other no matter what." She looked at each of them in turn. "You are my family because I chose you, and you chose me. That won't change when you grow up. It won't change if you move away, Get married or have children of your own. It will never change. Diego snuggled up to her shoulder. Even if we mess up sometimes? Especially then, Elena said, hugging them all. Because that's what families do. They forgive each other, help each other be better, and never, ever give up. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall, but inside their small, imperfect home, 5 people who had found each other against all odds sat warm and safe, secure in their place in the world. Spring came with the gentle insistence that made Elena believe in second chances. The snow melted slowly, revealing the small garden they had planted behind the house. Tiny green shoots proving that life could flourish even in the harshest conditions. Over the winter, the children had grown taller, their faces fuller, their laughter more uninhibited. Judge Morrison never returned, although rumors reached them that he was questioning people in town, loudly proclaiming proper procedures and legal precedents. But the villagers saw what Elena and the children had built, and they all silently understood that some things were more important than papers. Elena kept the diary where she found it, and neatly added her own entries below her father's last words. She wrote about Diego's first successful hunt, about Rosa's beautifully baked bread, about how Maria fiercely defended little Anna, about how their little family had learned to be friends, a refuge, and a support for each other. On the anniversary of her arrival, she wrote, Elena Vasquez, head of the family by choice and by the grace of God. We met as strangers and became something more precious than any treasure. We became a family. The children stopped asking when she would leave, stopped looking at her with fear, like those who expect to be abandoned. They began planning the next year in the garden, discussing improvements to the house, dreaming of a future in which she was as natural as breathing. Elena never married, never had children, never lived the life she had imagined when she first stepped off the stagecoach. But she found something better. She found her purpose, her people, her place in the world. She realized that love is not what happens to you, but what you choose to do every day, especially when it's hard. Years later, when travelers asked about the family on the hill, about the woman who raised 4 orphans and turned them into strong, capable adults who never forgot to visit her, always cared for each other, and never stopped believing in the power of chosen love, Elena told them the truth. I came here to marry a man I had never seen, she said. Instead, I found the family I always needed, and it changed my whole life. The house was still standing, now even stronger thanks to the repairs they had made together. The garden flourished, tended by hands that knew the value of every seed. And somewhere in the desert wind, if you listened closely, you could still hear the echo of a quiet promise, of love freely given, and of a family that proved that blood ties weren't the only thing that mattered. Elena Vasquez came to the West to find a husband. Instead, she became a mother, the backbone and heart of a home built not on documents or legal declarations, but on a simple, radical act, staying when it would have been easier to leave. And in the end, that was the only law that really mattered.